Hello everyone and welcome back to the Second Party Podcast. In the spirit of this podcast, I wanted to take a look at an ideology and steelman it, really give it our fullest attention and ask some questions about that. So today, I wanted to take a look at atheism. We've been talking a lot recently about Christianity or general theism, and I wanted to kind of flip the script and look at the other side of things a little bit. So with that, let's jump right in. In our last podcast episode, we analyzed the question, could the devil repent and be saved by Jesus? And, I think asking questions like this one are some of the best ways at getting at fundamental truths here. And we've been on Twitter recently asking some fundamental questions about, a bunch of different religions and kind of trying to drive at the core of these things to get a better understanding. And recently, we had a Twitter exchange with someone kind of about religion. And at one point in the conversation, the person noted that, many religious people, and I think this is a generalized sentiment too, that many religious people don't really think much about what they believe, and they have kind of poor justifications for it. And because of this, there are oftentimes kind of incongruencies or things that don't totally add up, things that are contradictory. And I think, many Christians and religious people may kind of balk at this, but I think that, this is probably actually correct. Wouldn't you say?
I mean, overall, probably, yeah. I don't know that that's necessarily specific to Christians. I think that overall, just people in general don't really think about what they believe or why. So I guess I don't necessarily see that as being unique to Christians or religious people.
Yeah, I'm not saying that it is, but, I do think that when people have these contentions with religious people in general, that there are incongruencies in their belief set, that is kind of a fair criticism. And
what kind of incongruencies? Do you mean people who maybe don't necessarily live out their faith?
No.
People who...
No, I'm talking about actual things in their belief set that are, I'll say, that appear to be contradictory, and they have poor explanations or justifications for those things. So when people ask questions, in my experience, many don't have answers or good answers to questions and haven't thought much about their faiths.
So then maybe the word you're looking for isn't incongruency so much as maybe lack of a deeper understanding. It's kind of a shallow understanding of what they believe. They don't know how to communicate something deeper.
Yeah, so I guess fundamentally what I'm saying here is that people oftentimes haven't thought much about their faiths, and as a result, when questions come up, they don't have great answers. Again, whether Christian or not.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of when you're in school and a lot of times the lessons you do are you have to prepare an instructional documentary or you have to teach it to the class or whatever, because actually the best way of being able to test how knowledgeable you are on something is to analyze your ability to actually teach that thing to other people. That's something I've seen for myself a lot. Sometimes I can feel knowledgeable about something or feel like I understand it, but if I can't explain it to someone else, I don't know that I really understand it.
Yeah, and I mean, that's part of this podcast, where we sit down and articulate things that we believe to better solidify and instantiate them into our own minds, as well as communicate them to each other or to other people. And I think that, say 51% of religious people don't think critically about it. And that's part of what I want to do in this podcast is increase the number of people, whether between us or with others, that are actually thinking critically about some of these religious questions and things like that.
Yeah. Yeah, and not to shy away from questions, because
Yeah.
being faced with a question or something that you don't know, if you encounter a question, you don't know how to answer it or how to articulate it, this is a great opportunity.
Yeah. Oftentimes people are kind of given their faith or their ideas by like their upbringing, by their family, by their
Yeah.
environment. And if you don't leave that bubble, whether it's your hometown or your family or what have you, and you're not talking about these things with other people, then it actually ends up kind of weak because it's never challenged. That tower is never attacked. It's never kind of metaphorically burned like a forest so that the strong trees can survive and actually grow back better than they would have otherwise.
Right. That's part of the problem of being in just kind of an echo chamber too, is you don't get people who are challenging your beliefs, which is a bad thing, and it actually weakens everyone's points and everyone's understanding.
Yeah. I mean, this is pretty well known and agreed upon when it comes to like the religious communities. But I also think that this exact same thing applies to those that claim to be like atheists or agnostics. I think that many are kind of given their mentality from schools or from peers, and they don't question it much, and they don't meet that much opposition. And then they kind of fail to actually contend with the ideas. And I'm not saying that there's no good reason or justification for something, or that nobody understands these things, or that it's stupid to believe something. Just like I don't think that that's true for a religious viewpoint. But I think that we can all agree that the majority of people probably aren't thinking really deeply about this. And I think too often the difference here is that atheists, I think, fail to recognize the leap of faith that's necessary to believe their ideas because they're not really challenged in that way.
Right. Yeah, I encounter a lot of people who are atheists or agnostic, and especially the people who are agnostic, they don't believe that they are necessarily making some strong claim about anything. They think they're just saying, "No, I don't know." So like I'm just going to sit and say I don't know. And it doesn't matter that much, but that is still a pretty strong belief. Like if you're saying you don't know and it doesn't matter that much to you, that potentially your eternal soul could be on the line. You don't know that for sure.
Yeah.
You should probably, that's not something you should just be like, whatever about. I guess I wouldn't think like that takes faith to sit here and say it's not that important. That is a statement of faith too. And it kind of depends on what your null hypothesis is too. This is what I've noticed. Like a lot of agnostics think if I just don't believe any of these religions, then I just default to whatever the null is. And they think the null is just, I don't know, or God doesn't exist or whatever. But that's a relatively new phenomenon. Like the idea that just the standard default view is just God doesn't exist, that's new. That's not what the history of humankind thought.
Yeah. I mean, I think the null hypothesis that you're talking about, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's generally speaking, for the average person, what you grew up with.
Possibly.
I'm saying generally.
What you think the default is just what's most familiar to you, probably.
Sure.
Maybe.
So, like, in your experience, you grew up in, like, a very Christian household.
I mean, I grew up, going to church. I grew up in the early 2000s, quote-unquote, Christian community. Christian radio, that is the environment I grew up in. Yeah.
Yeah, so, like, what was that like? Because that wasn't really, like, my experience. I had a very different experience. So, like, what's growing up in that type of community, what does that look like?
I mean, I don't know what exactly you're asking.
Like, what's the good, the bad, and the ugly about it?
Um, I mean, I think what's good about and this is all just based on my experience, I guess. I had, all my grandparents were just really very, fervently Christian, very much like going to grandma and grandpa's house, or my grandma's house was like, we're going to pray and we're going to watch Veggie Tales and we're going to read the Bible and pray before bed. And like that was just kind of the default that I always grew up in, and always listened to Christian radio. That was the only thing we ever listened to, like Christmas music. I grew up in a very small church, so it was a Baptist church, American Baptist church. So it was like Sunday potlucks and Sunday school and friends and stuff like that. But I guess I grew up not necessarily being super like intellectually challenged in what the beliefs I had were.
Okay.
So I didn't really think critically or understand a lot of things, I guess, until we met. And like, you are a very conscientious question type of person, so all of a sudden it was kind of like, oh yeah, why do I believe XYZ? I just kind of always did. And I don't necessarily remember a time when I didn't believe God exists, or I didn't believe, in Jesus or whatever. I don't know that necessarily means that my faith, at least for me personally, wasn't always strong. I guess I always felt very strongly like connected to God, I guess.
Okay.
And going through like difficult parts of my life when I was a teenager and stuff, I found myself like turning to the Bible and really trusting God and journaling about that. So I think even as, a 10, 12, 14-year-old, I had a very like strong faith, maybe emotionally.
Okay.
And experientially. Like, I really was convicted and believed in, God and his love for me, and that he was always there for me and I didn't have to be afraid and all this stuff. And I do think part of that was just because that was what I was always around. And my grandma specifically like demonstrated that very strongly. So I just grew up knowing that's something I could trust in. At the same time, like I said, I wasn't challenged with countering views really. So I think there are bad parts of certain things with this kind of quote unquote Christian culture, modern Christian culture, that is not necessarily attributable to one person or one thing, but it's maybe just ingrained in the culture, which is like atheism is like our enemy, right? People who are atheists are just like, they're the bad guys kind of thing. And not that I was like a mean-spirited person. I was always very like, I don't know, people pleaser, very non-confrontational. I wasn't like a mean-spirited person, I don't think. But there is kind of this weird thing in Christian culture that is like, especially when you're a kid, it's like, ooh, atheism. People who don't believe in God, this is bad.
Okay.
Like, think about the movie God's Not Dead. Literally, the atheist is the bad guy. Like, and he's depicted as a bad guy.
Yeah, so, I mean...
That's so indicative of what of at least the environment that I found myself in. Atheism, atheists, bad guys.
Yeah, I mean, so
That's not good, if I wasn't clear. That is a bad part of that.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree. I grew up with a very different, like, null hypothesis or experience, very different setup than that. I kind of alluded to this in previous episodes, but I feel like my parents kind of presented options, but there were minimal requirements. And as a result, I looked into a lot of different things and kind of tried on like different things to see how that would work. Because I think that's I think that's part of how you get an understanding of something. And, because of that, I have a very different cultural experience with Christianity. Like, to me, there's not much of a cultural association with Christianity versus, like, what I see a lot is things that are professed to be Christian in nature. Like, oh, this is a biblical thing. And the reality is, it's just something common in American Christian culture that is not necessarily part and parcel of being a Christian, if that makes sense. So, like on our last podcast episode, red and a pitchfork is not necessarily part and parcel of like the devil, but it's associated with it. Similarly, I think that some of these things, like what you're describing, the cultural environment that you grew up in, that really wasn't my experience. So after experiencing the church environment more, to me, that's something I get really passionate about and kind of take issue with. I think the focus should be more on the core beliefs rather than some cultural aspect of it. And recently, I've wanted to take a look at some other religious beliefs and belief systems and discuss them. So tonight, I wanted to take some time to kind of steelman atheism, like we talked about earlier. I want to detail what I believe to be kind of like the best argument for it and explore it a little bit deeper. While obviously it's a belief system that I disagree with quite strongly, I think you expressed this well earlier. The truth does not hurt positions that are tenable. By extension, any investigation into, like a different religion that leads to new knowledge or truth should not be something to shy away from. And I think that we should have a better understanding of other religions or other belief systems to be able to either A, witness to those people if, say, you're a Christian, or B, to better understand how others function in the world, no matter what religion you are. If you think that learning information is going to hurt your position, whether it's that of atheism or religion, then I think that's kind of like a big red flag, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I mean, assuming that your ultimate goal is to find and believe the truth.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's a fair clarification.
Which you are assuming is everyone's ultimate end goal. I'm sure some people maybe don't think about it that way, or they actually maybe don't care that much about the actual truth.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good clarification. But I think on this podcast, we want to get at the truth. So with that being said, let's not shy away from this and let's talk about atheism. I believe that the best argument for atheism, and one of the best arguments against it, can be found in the question, what is the best argument for belief in atheism? And like we did last time, with the question, could the devil repent and be saved by Jesus? I think that we can break down this question and answer it. So let's do exactly that. So I think the first question that I want to kind of dive into here today is, what do we mean by believe? So Webster's defines belief as a state or habit of mind in which trust or confidence is placed in some person or thing. But I think this kind of is a little bit ambiguous and a little bit difficult to apply to day-to-day life. Because how can we know whether someone, ourselves included, actually believes something? Is belief just something that you profess to think? Like if I just say, oh, well, I believe blank, does that mean that I believe that thing? No, it's not. Plenty of people say that they believe things and clearly don't by their actions. If I say, I believe I'm a fish, you wouldn't think that I actually believe that. I've done nothing to demonstrate or prove that I actually believe that thing. I've done nothing in line with that belief. And as such, you would confidently say that you have no confidence that I believe that I'm a fish, right? So belief has to be something more than simply a statement of it. It has to yield something. A belief that doesn't yield anything is not a belief at all.
Sure. I mean, if you just say you believe something, then it's kind of either I can take you at your word and assume that A, you're being honest and you're actually saying what you actually believe,
Mm-hmm.
and that B, you are self-aware enough to know what it is you actually believe. Which
Yeah,
I
that's
don't
a
think
good
we can just
point.
assume that everyone is self-aware enough that they know exactly what they believe about everything. You could say you believe something and be lying about that. Or you could say you believe something and be true, and it could be true. You could actually believe that. Or you could say you believe something and it's true that you think you believe that, but you don't actually believe that.
Yeah, that's a good point. But I do think that we should clarify, you know, someone can believe something and not adhere to that belief 100% of the time, right? Like 100% adherence isn't necessary for belief, but obviously I think some adherence is. And we can kind of debate to what degree that's really necessary. But I think ultimately that question is similar to like the ship of Theseus example. It's not clearly knowable, but it is clear that you have to adhere to that belief set or be acting on it in at least some way.
So your argument is basically if you say you believe something,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like if I say I believe saving money, investing in my future, this is a good thing. And this is what you should be doing. I believe that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But if I don't do that, I go and I spend money frivolously and whatever, then you would say, I don't know that you actually believe that. Is that what you're saying? Because if you did, it should necessarily produce actions that are in line with that belief.
Yeah, so I mean, you could say, like, I think that saving money is probably a good thing. And that's like, you know, your intellect just saying something. Okay, you're making a mental calculation. You're doing just the math and you're recognizing it. But saying I believe to me has a nature of action to it. And that's not to say that you can't ever frivolously spend money and then assert that you believe saving money is best, because nobody's perfect. But
Right.
if you never save money and you always frivolously spend and you say, I believe that saving money is the way to manage finances, then I would say, I don't really believe you. I don't think that you actually believe that thing. You may intellectually understand it, you may be able to do the math, but you don't actually believe that. Because if you did, that would manifest in action in some way.
So you're kind of trying to take like a faith plus works argument and apply it to belief.
No, no, I'm solely looking at belief itself.
Yeah, but what I mean by that is the faith plus works thing is like, how do you know or see if someone truly has faith? It's based on the outward works or fruit that they produce. And if that isn't there, then you sit and be like, well, are you really an apple tree if you're not producing apples? You're saying, oh, if you're not living in a way according to X belief, are you really believing that thing? That's what I mean by, is that kind of what you're doing, applying that type of argument or mentality?
Yeah, kind of, but I would say also that, like, so let's think about someone who, in a moment, doesn't necessarily adhere to the beliefs that they profess. These people are often called hypocrites, but the problem is that hypocrisy, which is defined as the practice of professing beliefs, feelings, or virtues that one does not hold or possess,
Yeah.
like, that's a different thing. Because in a moment, you can do something that's against a belief but not be a hypocrite. A hypocrite is saying that you believe something and you don't. The not doing something could be evidence of hypocrisy, but it's not necessarily hypocrisy in and of itself. So what I'm saying is, I don't think it's faith plus works. I think belief is like a state of mind that results in sufficient resolve enough to compel one to act. And there's kind of like a note here that would differentiate this from like the works thing that you kind of roughly outlined, which is that technically one could have a belief yet not have encountered an opportunity to act on that belief yet, and they could still hold the belief. So for instance,
Sure.
if you say, oh, I believe that being financially frugal is the best way of doing things, but you've never been given an opportunity to spend money, or you've not been in charge of money, you can still believe that thing but have not gotten an opportunity to act on it. And I think that any other definition of like what belief is ends up cascading into a bunch of definitional problems, because then you ask yourself, like, what is a hypocrite then?
So when you're talking about a hypocrite, is what you're saying that you're not a hypocrite for saying, oh, I think that you shouldn't gossip. Okay. If you say, I think you shouldn't gossip, and then, you know, you gossip. Okay. And then but you sit here and say, yeah, that wasn't good. I shouldn't have done that. You basically are maybe repentant of that to some way. Like, that's not being a hypocrite just because you've done it, because we all fail at that. But being a hypocrite would be going out and preaching, hey, you shouldn't gossip, this is bad, but then you're like a serial gossiper.
Sure, I guess the other thing I'd say is, if you were a serial gossiper and then you decided and you changed your belief that gossiping is bad, you may still gossip, but I think for me to like agree that you believe that there actually has been a change in your belief, I would need to see some amount of decrease in overall gossiping. You may still gossip in a certain instance, but I should see an overall decrease in the gossiping.
Sure.
So I want to circle back and kind of read through what I think belief really is. I think belief is a state of mind that results in sufficient resolve enough to compel one to act. So enough to compel one to act.
Right. Okay.
So there are some instances where you still don't act in accordance with it, and there are instances where you have not been given the opportunity to act, but the belief is enough to compel one to act, and as a result, in at least some circumstances where you would have acted in one way, you now act in a different way because your belief has changed. Does that make sense?
I think so. And what is a hypocrite then?
A hypocrite is someone who professes a certain belief and does not believe that thing. Does not actually believe that thing.
So it's not necessarily that their actions don't line up with the belief 100% of the time. Because you're saying you can sometimes have your actions not line up, but it could still be true that you believe that thing.
Correct.
So what's an actual example of hypocrisy based on that definition then?
Let's say someone's with their kid and their kid wants to eat a bunch of candy for dinner. And they tell the kid, no, you can't eat candy for dinner. It's bad for people to eat candy for dinner. And then they eat candy for dinner every single night.
The parent does?
Yeah. That would be hypocrisy, because what the parent said was eating candy for dinner every night is bad for someone. And then they do it every single night. Now, maybe they eat candy for dinner every other night, and before they came to that belief or realization, they ate it every night. That would be an example of, like, somebody struggling with their belief, let's say.
Sure. Or maybe if you on one instance see this parent and it's dinner and they're eating candy and you're like,
sure,
oh, you hypocrite, you say all the time to your kid, but if that's not necessarily a systemic thing for them, you're saying that is not necessarily just hypocrisy.
Correct.
in that instance.
Yeah. So that instance
Because
could be evidence of hypocrisy, but is not sufficient evidence.
as long as they do still actually believe that you shouldn't do that.
As
Right.
long as their action from not believing to believing in net has changed.
Okay, so there's not an absolute scale then in that sense. Because if you eat candy for dinner every night, but now you only do it half the nights, you could be like, hey, look, I'm not a hypocrite. But some of us would say eating candy for dinner half the time is still, what are you doing?
Sure. Maybe the best way of vocalizing it would be generalized progression in one direction. So if you think about like the stock market, for example, the generalized progression is like if you take the S&P 500 is trending upward.
Yeah.
Now, in 1 year even, it may be down. Over a day, it can certainly be down. But over a 10-year period, it's going up.
Sure. So a hypocrite would be someone who sits here and says, I believe this thing, but overall the general projection of their life is not in line with that.
Correct.
To the point where you sit and you question, do you actually believe that thing?
Correct.
And it seems like you don't, and yet you profess to, you are being hypocritical.
Mm-hmm. So I want to reiterate it again. I think belief is a state of mind that results in sufficient resolve enough to compel one to act on it. Okay. So now let's kind of pivot a bit. Now that we know what belief is, what is the best argument for belief in atheism? I believe the best argument for atheism comes down to A/B testing. In A/B testing, one compares two options on a set of standard characteristics critical to the thing being tested. The definition given specifically by Wikipedia says, A/B testing is a shorthand for a simple randomized controlled experiment in which two samples, A and B, of a single vector variable are compared. These values are similar except for one variation which might affect a user's behavior. A/B tests are widely considered the simplest form of controlled experiment. However, by adding more variants to the test, its complexity grows. So what does this mean like in practical applications for those of us who are not of the engineering scientific mindset? So let's say someone is designing a screwdriver and we're considering two different metals or metal alloys for the driver shaft, and we want to determine which one is going to be better. We would begin by determining desirable characteristics from this shaft. In this case, let's say it's desirable to have a hard driver tip, resilient to wear, and a stiff driver shaft to prevent bending. Now that we've defined the desirable characteristics, we could test the two options for these characteristics. One could drive 50 screws in with each option and measure how much the tip has worn away. Say another desirable characteristic is bend resistance. One could put an increasing bending load on both drivers and measure the deflection. These tests could be compared for the drivers, and then whichever option performed better under the set of characteristics would be chosen. Now, this is a very specific kind of like micro example, but it can be applied to macro things as well. So let's take kind of a hot button issue nowadays, which is economic systems. To keep things simple, let's imagine a continuum where on the left we have pure capitalism, where individuals are the sole owners of production, labor, and value, and on the right we have pure communism, where the government owns all production, labor, and value. We can place each economic system somewhere on this simple continuum. So North Korea is going to be on the far right, the US is pretty far left, and Sweden is going to be somewhere in between, right? Each country can be placed somewhere on this simplified continuum. What we can then do is compare two extreme examples and determine a set of characteristics that we find valuable and measure it in both situations to decide which one we think is best. But this requires us, at least to some degree, trying out both of these examples. So what we could do is we could measure people's overall happiness, and we could survey people on that. And then we could figure out what point on this continuum optimizes for happiness. We could do 2 tests. We could do the US and North Korea, and then we could find out the US is better. And then we could run the experiment again. We could do the US and Sweden, and maybe Sweden falls out better. Now, this is an example of like a real macro level test, so there aren't that many controls necessarily in place because you're dealing with whole economic systems. And A/B testing, in its truest, best sense, is primarily done in a controlled scientific sense, in a lab, and sometimes with simulations. However, I think that you can kind of do this in your mind as well. In fact, not only can you do this, but you actually already do this if you think about it. Let's consider any decision you're going to make. Your mind projects itself into a simulated future to try and understand the outcomes of a given decision, right? It does this so that the kind of avatar manifestation of yourself can suffer consequences without having real physical detrimental consequences for the real you. So let's talk about like a real extreme example of this. Many experience something called call of the void, or sometimes called the high place phenomena. The phrase called call of the void actually originated in French. Insert French pronunciation because I'm not going to try it here. And describes an impulse to hurl yourself into, well, a void of sorts. It commonly manifests as urges to do things like steer into oncoming traffic, jump off of high places, touch things known to be hot, and more. While this may sound like suicidal tendencies, the person experiencing it has no desire to actually end their life. It's merely an inclination and an asking of the generalized question. In these circumstances, one can imagine both scenarios, one where they steer into oncoming traffic and are hurt, and one where they don't and are fine. And we can mentally simulate both and adopt a mentality of both, right? I think that we can do the same thing with belief. We can imagine what a decision would result in and understand it fully without acting on it yet. So what does this mean for belief in atheism? To believe something is, at least in part, to take it seriously enough to understand the conclusions that it comes to and to have the will to act on that. Sometimes there's uncertainty about that, which would result in things needing to be tried, like seeing how far one can throw a ball in a field. You may know approximately how far you can throw, but you don't know exactly, and you may have to actually throw the ball to understand how far it goes. And I think that this can kind of be applied to atheism as well. So when we say what's the best argument for belief in atheism, I think it's that to fully understand the set of options in front of you, you almost need to adopt something akin to belief to fully understand it. And perhaps you even need to adopt the belief itself to fully understand it.
So it sounds like essentially what you're saying is the best argument to believe in atheism is because you want to analyze or test it to be able to understand it.
Yeah, I think test is the right word there. Because how can you know whether something is a productive mindset or not without testing it in some capacity? Either A, you test it in like a simulated mental capacity. And I would argue that to properly test that, you need to have something akin to belief. And sometimes you may need to actually test that thing. And that would require belief to actually take that step, to actually act upon something. And I think if you're going to truly do your due diligence with something, I find it kind of akin to belief. Like when you're going through the scientific method, what you want to do if you're testing two things is part of you should be taking this objective view where you're not rooting for one option or another. But then there also needs to be two parts of you that occur at different points in time that are devoted enough to one specific thing that you actually go forward with it. Because if you have no faith that a certain thing could work out or will work out, then you'll never actually test that thing. So in our screwdriver example, if you have no faith whatsoever that a certain metal alloy is going to work out, then you're never going to test that metal alloy. And if you never test that metal alloy, how do you know that the metal alloy that you have is the best one? And I think the answer is, in many cases, you don't. Now, you may be able to run some simulations to determine which metal alloy is best. You're probably not going to want a gold screwdriver that's very soft and going to be very expensive. So that may be fine to write off from...
Just the theoretical understanding of it, you mean?
Yeah. But even that, I think, requires enough, let's say, belief that that is an option to at least consider it. And especially when we get into like these nuances of things, I think that having enough thought and belief in something to test it, I think that's probably the only way that you're going to be able to know for sure whether or not you have, in the screwdriver example, the best metal for the job. How are you going to know that you have the best, religious view on the world unless you've actually, truly contemplated and considered all others?
So when you say best, do you mean truest or the true or accurate one? Because you say best, but I don't know. It's not immediately apparent that that's what that
sure.
means.
Yes.
Okay.
That's what I mean by it. How do you know that you have that which is true if you've never given the time of day to something and actually thought about it? Now, there are some things where you can sit here and mentally simulate it and understand, that's not something that I want to do, right? Like what you're doing in Call of the Void. It's very obvious. You don't need to actually test that thing to know that, it's not a good idea.
Right. And I'm sure a lot of people probably fall into the category of, I don't feel like I need to test atheism. I guess I understand what you're saying. Personally, I guess I don't feel a need to, not to not try to understand it or understand the best arguments, but I don't feel a need to, position myself in a place of leap of faith belief in it in order to actually try it out, I guess, to believe it.
So what you're saying is you don't think the level of belief reaches a point that it necessitates something beyond the simulation test.
For atheism?
Yeah.
I've never believed in atheism. But I feel like I've thought about it intellectually, maybe theoretically, or in a simulation, if you will.
Well, so then I would posit that there's at least part of you that at least at some point did believe that, if you've truly considered it. Now you can say, it never became integrated into my personality and fully acted upon. But there's some sub-personality. You can have arguments in your mind where two avatars of you argue for different positions. And if you've actually done your due diligence, one of those avatars in your mind represented the, let's say, atheistic worldview, and argued fervently for it, and that required that sub-personality, let's say, to have a belief in it.
Okay, but I don't know that would mean that I could say I believed atheism or believed in it.
I'm not saying that you would say that colloquially, but I think that some people do need to try on certain things or get into an acting stage of something to understand whether or not that thing is true. Like, have there not been things that you've thought, this is interesting enough to where I need to go beyond just like the mental simulation of it to really understand like where the ball lands. I understand it's somewhere in that general vicinity, but I need further clarity to be able to determine whether it's A or B.
I mean, I guess it depends on the person and it depends on the topic. Like, it kind of reminds me of how I've heard it preached about tithing. God, when our church talks about tithing, and they say, you know, conceptually speaking, it doesn't really make sense that you would give 10%, you know, of what you make to the church to back to God, and that you would actually be like rewarded greater than that in return. Like, we can sit here and in our mind say that from a numbers standpoint, let me crunch the numbers, that doesn't make sense. But like how our church talks about tithing is, I think they say it's like one of, if not the only time in the Bible where we see God saying like, test me in this. And so our church kind of is like, we think you should test this. Even if you don't believe that you should be tithing, you don't believe this is the right thing to do, you should try it.
So I legitimately think, and I hold this belief so fervently, and when I say that I believe it, I mean that I believe it. Reference the definition from earlier, that enough to act on this belief. I believe that if you are considering Christianity, if you're doing the thing with Christianity that I'm describing with atheism here, and you get to a point where you're like, this should be acted on, I can tell you exactly the thing that you should test, and it's tithing.
Yeah, I mean, I feel very strongly that, maybe it sounds crazy, but yeah, this is how our church preaches on it too, that there's some crazy things that happen when you tithe.
So
there are some crazy things that happen when you tithe, I should say.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we could probably do a whole podcast episode on just tithing, but I think for me, because I grew up in a household where things were kind of presented to me, I have a very disagreeable personality, and as a result, when confronted with a belief, kind of go for the jugular right away with a belief system. And the going for the jugular, let's say, for Christianity, for me, was, okay, well, you say, put it all on the line. You say you can test God in this thing. There's the rich man who speaks to Jesus, and he's unwilling to give up his money, but has kept all of these commandments. I think all of these I looked at and I said, fine, if your ultimate thing, if the thing that you say, test us in this thing, is tithing, then I will do that. I'll do exactly that thing. And for me, that is probably the thing that I would say brought me fully into the faith. And I will say I went for the jugular on a lot of different faiths and feel like they fell real flat. And, I hope to kind of outline that a little bit in some of this podcast for some different faiths here. But I wanted to start out kind of giving things a bit of the benefit of the doubt of steel manning things so that it doesn't seem like I'm just trying to tear everything to shreds. Because I do think that there's a good argument for what I would say belief in atheism, certainly enough to mentally simulate certain tenets and how that would affect your life, but also for some people at some point acting on those things and testing out different belief systems and seeing where it gets you.
By the way, it's in Malachi 3:10 specifically. God is talking to Israel, and he says, "Bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house. Test me in this, says the Lord Almighty, and see if I will not throw open the floodgates of heaven and pour out so much blessing that there will not be room enough to store it."
Yeah.
And I legitimately have seen that so tangibly happen in my life.
Yeah, I mean, I think
When
that
I
we
s-
should probably do a full podcast episode on that, because there's a lot to dive into there.
Yeah, I'm sure there is, but I just was thinking about that, how it related to this topic. Like, I don't know if that's similar to what you're saying, but
Yeah, it
the
is.
level of test something, try it out, see if it's actually true. And that's one of the ways, like, you know, if you are testing out a tithe, like, you are giving your money. That is, you're arguing, that is a sense of belief.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, we've talked about in the podcast before, setting up a tower of sorts, erecting a tower and trying to attack it to see if that idea stands the test. And to me, like, the underlying assumption is that you've erected a tower. So to be able to test something, a belief system like atheism, well, you got to start by erecting that tower. And I think too often I see with Christians a complete lack of understanding of atheism, of atheistic belief. And to me, it's really indicative of folks not having done the due diligence to really analyze that. You know, I think when we ask the question, what is the best argument for belief in atheism? I said at the beginning, I think the answer is in the question for best, and the answer is in the question for worst. And the best was actually analyzing something, I would argue, necessitates some degree of belief in that thing, and that you should give plenty of things due diligence, atheism being one of those. But I also think that on the flip side, in the question, when we say atheism, I think arguably atheism, that word specifically, is probably one of the better arguments against atheism. And what I mean by that is that atheism, I think, is actually kind of a good name for the belief set, because I think a large majority of its focus seems to be an antithesis to, or a disproving of, religious people, whether Christian or anyone else, rather than an actual advocating for something. I think it's a belief system that so often is against things rather than it is for something. Atheism, to me, in mass, says religion is wrong, but I don't see a prevailing universal viewpoint, an assertion about the way that the world is and how we ought to act in it. And you can say, well, these couple of people agree on it in this way. The rationales behind things, how it's supposed to be practically acted out, these things are in no way consistent from what I've observed, apart from being against religion itself.
So would you say that you have believed, quote unquote, in atheism then?
I think in the context of this discussion, I would say yes. The colloquial answer would probably be no, because people's colloquial definition of belief, I think, is kind of incorrect. But in the context of this discussion, with what I've defined the word belief to be, yeah.
So when you say you think it's the best but also the worst argument for atheism, that latter part, is that just because it's your belief that if you really do take on that hat, believe it and test it, that it is going to fall apart?
Well, that, and I think the reason that it falls apart is because I would argue that as a belief system, it seems more like an anti-belief system than a belief system, which is to say that it seems to not assert many things apart from disproving other things. And what I find really uncompelling about that is human beings are predisposed to be affected significantly more by negatives than positives. This is evolutionarily true. This is why losses are felt significantly more than wins. The ratio is somewhere between 3-1 and 5-1. That's why in relationships you need significantly more positive comments than negative comments to be able to actually feel like you're at a good place, like at an equilibrium. And the problem that I have is because it's so much easier to tear things down, whether literally or figuratively, it's way more difficult to destroy a house than it is to build one. And because atheism, in my view and in my experience, is so focused around like tearing things down, I think that it's seen as something more compelling than it actually is. And I think you need to mentally make an adjustment for tearing down versus building up. Like a great example, and I'm not speaking to specific people, I'm not speaking to specific communities, I'm speaking to a belief set in general. I oftentimes find that atheism is suspiciously absent when bad things happen. When there's a young child who's lost his father, atheism doesn't seem to be there. Religious people across many walks of faith, I see, stepping into those tough times, into the trenches, to help people. Whether they're right or wrong, religion seeks to provide answers and attempts to posit something. But I feel like atheism oftentimes seems to say that religion is wrong and dumb to believe in, but then fails to provide an alternative solution. Or if it does, it's not something consistent across atheism. In my experience, atheists' lack of a cognitive set of principles that are held by a large group of them. If you're talking to a kid with like a recently deceased parent about an atheistic worldview, this is likely just going to make things worse. It's going to lead the kid to nihilism. This is not going to help this kid in life. It's not going to be productive. I feel like from what I've observed, it's something that doesn't really work in the real bad times. And it intentionally avoids situations like that. Recently, we went to a funeral for your grandma. Mm-hmm. And we had to travel a little ways. And, she had dementia in the end. And her quality of life was rough. And she died at, relatively speaking, a pretty old age, right?
Upper 70s, yeah.
And, obviously people are mourning her loss and having a rough time. And, they're grieving because somebody who is a big part of their life isn't there anymore, right? But I'll tell you, the people who were most at peace, the people who were happiest, the people who were strongest there, the people who had the best outlook, they were people who had a belief that there was something more, that this wasn't the end. And the uplifting messages that I heard were from people speaking about exactly those things. What wasn't present at all was anyone advocating for an atheistic worldview.
Do you think the fact that that is not a comfort or a thing that people find themselves turning to in these types of situations, you think that in and of itself gives validity to a religious worldview, or is evidence against an atheist one? Like, I think the atheist retort to that would be like, okay, yeah, that's great, people feel good, but that means nothing about whether or not it's true.
I think what you posited there, that because people want to believe that in the hard times, I think you can look at it two very different ways. The first is, you could say, well, that has absolutely no bearing on what is or isn't true, how people feel. And in a physical, literal sense, yeah, you're right. At the same time, not everything occurs in the physical, real world. There are metaphysical aspects to things that are oftentimes more real than their physical counterparts. And we've talked about this before, and Jordan Peterson uses this example, but when you watch The Lion King, it's a story about a bunch of lions that interact with and live in a pride and have a relation to animals that makes absolutely no sense in our physical world. But it speaks to a greater, deeper truth about the nature of growing up, of fulfilling one's destiny, of becoming an adult, of the relationships between men and women, and what compels men to get up, live up to their potential, establish a family, and honor their parents. And when I hear that something helped someone get through the hard times, I struggle to sit here and say to them, well, that's a bunch of phony BS. I struggle to sit here and say, there's nothing to that. Clearly there was something to that to them. And if there's something metaphysical that has a serious effect on the physical, like helping someone grieve, like giving someone the peace to be able to go up on stage at a relative's funeral and honor them and talk about them, why is it that we sit here and say that there's anything less real about that than there is about something in the physical world?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I don't know that atheism necessarily believes in something beyond the physical. But that
I would seriously challenge them on that, because I don't know anyone who, in our previously outlined definition of belief, there are very few people that I see advocating for or living a life that says that the physical is just irrelevant, or says that there's nothing outside of the physical. The fact that we have a consciousness, I think it's almost undeniable, more so than there is that there's a physical world, that there's something beyond just the physical. I mean, love for a family member, love for a child. Now, you may not believe that there's some all-knowing, all-powerful God who cares about you behind all of that. But when I hear that a child who lost their father is able to get up and grieve, but continue on with his day and with his life, and that people are heavily assisted, and I see people, and the happiest people at a funeral are those who hold to some kind of theistic belief, I struggle to say that there's no evidence there. If people's ability to overcome, if the things that people do, if the things that compel them to actually change the real world don't matter, I think there's a lot in the physical world that also doesn't matter then. You know? I think that, one of the biggest contentions that there is with atheism is a lack of completely knowing something. This is usually dubbed faith. I think that's a little bit ambiguous because people often posit that faith is blind. But most people, I think, in the theistic side of things, don't have blind faith. I think it's oftentimes poorly articulated, like we started off this conversation with, but it's not blind. I think not knowing completely and trusting something, even though there's not a verifiably true thing, is actually part of the argument for Christianity. I know it's argued from the atheistic worldview a lot of the times, but I actually think it's an argument for Christianity. I've talked about this before, but I had a lot of food issues, as did my sister and my mom. And I went to a number of different doctors, and the doctors weren't able to figure it out. And then we slowly started eliminating things. And through personal testing, we found out what worked best and what yielded the most positive results. And the things weren't the answers that I was looking for. They weren't the answers that I was hoping for. I was hoping for something else. I was hoping for something where I could just take some pill and keep on living my life. And I think sometimes people are hoping for something different than what they find. I'll be the first to admit I was hoping for something different than the belief set that I have. I don't think that being a theist, that being a Christian, is an easy thing. I wish that I didn't have things that I was called to, that I didn't have responsibilities that I felt were required of me. I was wishing for that. But like my food issues, I got something else. And like my food issues, I came to something that I wasn't hoping for, but ultimately it made things a hell of a lot better. And there's not a scientific way to prove either of these things. And it's certainly based in my experiences. But there's no evidence for either of them. Just because the doctors can't take blood and tell me that I'm lactose intolerant and gluten intolerant doesn't mean that it's not what works. And I'll tell you, for me, if truth is not that which is functional and yields the best results, that which works, I don't know what truth is then. We said earlier, the truth does not hurt positions that are tenable. Being off gluten and dairy doesn't hurt me. It helps me feel a lot better. And it works for me. And being a Christian, like gluten and dairy, while it wasn't something that I was hoping for when I walked in, it's a thing that I think works and is tenable and has been tested. And while much of that may be specific to me, I think other Christians, especially those who have really thought about it, fall into a similar boat. It was through this testing, I would say, of Christianity that I came to know that it was true. And it was through testing of other belief sets and religions that I came to believe that they were false. And I think that is the best argument for believing in atheism. That it, like all belief sets, should be tested. Well, with that, it's getting late. But recently I've been musing about a conversation I had with my grandpa. It was kind of trivial, but he said that he really liked peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, and I've never really taken a liking to peanut butter and jelly. I like peanut butter on its own, and I like jelly on its own. But together, I've never found that combination really compelling. I think the main reason behind it is my family was maybe a bit of peanut butter and jelly snobs. We had like nicer jellies or jams, and we had really good peanut butter. And I think too often peanut butter and jelly are combined because you have a mediocre version of both, and then when combined, it's slightly better than mediocre. But I think for folks that actually have good peanut butters and good jellies, I think they're better on their own. I think to fully appreciate each, they ought to be separated. Or maybe it's just a taste thing with me. Maybe there are others out there that are in my same boat. If you are, feel free to let us know. Send us an email at secondpartypodcast@gmail.com. We'd love to hear your thoughts on peanut butter and jelly or any of the other topics that we've covered. With that, thank you again, everyone. Have a good night.